It's anachronistic to posit that there were distinct times in the past where people valued truth over their base biases. This time likely has never existed, but only through surviving cultural touchstones do we attach these virtues to our memories. You could think of the Hellenistic period of Rome, for example, with the scribes, historians, the lush debates. The Library of Alexandria before and through this era was a long-standing paragon of this idea. But of course, all types of barbarity, cruelty, and stupidity ruled the day right alongside them, in the same government, even. It was just a matter of having a stable enough society to safely foster and preserve the intellectual growth in the maths and sciences that would shape the world as we know it. More recently, the Renaissance is the most clear example of this, clear by its nickname of the Enlightenment, where again a resurgence of these virtues are captivatingly contained into the cultural memory. Yet concurrent with some placements for the end of the era overlap, they overlap with hysteria about vampires and witches, with theologians of the time even writing serious works trying to deal with the theological implications of if it were in fact true that vampires were real, despite it all being myth and hysteria. The French Revolution, the framing of the United States Constitution, also marked an inflection point. To take the ideas of a new Roman Republic built on scientific Renaissance ideals as a new country unscathed by the cultural identity of a single culture, but instead rather reintegrating the idea of Rome as these so many different cultures and ideas. Of myth and tradition, but this was a farce too. Many cultures of humanity existed for time immemorial, and even to the time where the settlers landed. And not to forget that the settlers had their own cultural mania of burning to death innocent women for the fake crime of practicing witchcraft. At every turn where advancements were made, these biases pushed back. Whether it be the Catholic Church's stranglehold on the most negatively remembered era in Europe, often coined the Dark Ages, colloquially, and even crossing into the Renaissance as they sent Inquisition and burned alive Giordano Bruno for daring propose that there was life beyond the firmament and the waters held above and below the earth. His ideas, and the ideas that he popularized of others, like that of each star being a far distant sun, was radical and seemingly larger than life, and more importantly, seemingly anti-Catholic. These were a total fantasy, and yet these ideas were slowly confirmed, despite how ridiculous they seemed to the people living at the time. Now, most modern people don't even know that those in the not-so-distant past believed that the Earth had four corners setting atop pillars above the ocean below our visions where the serpents lay, with the firmament being moved by the hand of God like Earth was a terrarium or a snow globe in the corner of God's bedroom. This isn't to say Bruno was killed for scientific beliefs, specifically, as is sometimes framed, but rather more broadly for his free thought and refusal to recuse himself to his supposed betters manning the Catholic Church. His death became a beacon to the ideas and virtues of free thought and the retrospective value in obtaining a society where real inquiry lies without punishment, but is instead celebrated. It's somewhat cynical, or it has been, that booms of enlightenment are often followed by generations who were not properly handed the torch, and so sometimes that torch is dropped or intentionally thrown away by the powerful. Bruno exists in the cultural memory today as a living metaphor to the virtues placed upon him. Going back farther, the mystery cults and hermeticism of the centuries before that brought in the common era over 2,000 years ago were consistent in shaping gods of their world by their surroundings, specifically in the lines between myth and reality becoming indistinguishable. Was Rome truly founded upon the brotherly blood spilt by Romulus killing Remus? Did Venus really plead with the gods to warn Julius Caesar of his oncoming treachery? Did the gods then cause the sky to rain blood and the streets to be filled with ghosts to warn those residing in Rome of what was to come? Did Venus go into the halls of the Senate after Brutus stabbed Caesar to retrieve his soul? Did his spirit then in her arms blaze out of them into heaven above, becoming a star? The cultural memory of humanity is not history, but metaphor. We understand these mythical tales not as literal, but reflections of the context and the experiences, narrativized. And not to think that we're above it. We, in the same way, narrativize our current realities. Without a thought, we debate what politicians represent, stand for, or will do. They themselves exist most likely as a lightning rod for the people's will and understanding, and the most sinister people oft take charge of the stream's flow. If you control the knowledge, how much they're allowed to know, and the ways in which they are able to gather information to construct these personal narratives, and to what extent they are given a vehicle to spread those feelings, you control the world. Own the public square, and you own people's very thoughts. Of course, owning the public square is counterintuitive. When an unaccountable class, group, or even just person privatizes the public square, it bends it to their interests, and never the humans contained within it. As I've quoted before, if you can convince the lowest white man he's better than the best colored man, he won't notice you picking his pocket. Hell, give him someone to look down on, and he'll empty his pockets for you. The playbook of divide and conquer is older than humanity itself. Turn your victims against each other, and you won't even have to do the fighting. So, we need to pick our metaphors carefully. Take the right messages from the suffering of generations past. In a particularly relevant conversation, Dr. John Dominic Crossan discussed this idea of metaphors in history, and so I'm going to allow him, the expert, to put it in pretty straightforward words I think everyone could understand.
I take it with deadly seriousness, because metaphors are what we live by. We like to think, oh, they're a fancy thing that poets do, and they're fun. Metaphors are what we live by. And as we live them out, they become reality. So, to do an example from the 1930s, the New Deal with Roosevelt in America is a metaphor. Okay, people began to live according to it and create the American reality of the 30s. Over in Germany, they had a different metaphor from Hitler, and it was called the Third Reich.
And these are metaphysical concepts in a way.
They really are. I mean, if everyone said, and nobody tried to live them, then
they have an effect on the world.
Yeah. So, watch your metaphors.
Yeah. So we might be living in a new one right now.
Exactly. So right now, for example, one way of seeing the contest in the last election was 2 mega metaphors.
Right.
And we're going to see now how they work out. They're going to create reality.
One of them definitely just won out.
So now what we're going to be watching, starting in January, is American reality being formed by a specific metaphor. I hope it will be a good one. I hope the reality will be good.
In some regard, then, even if how people largely construct their world is more literal today than in the ancient past, they still experience and fight for the things that they see as representing their own narratives. So a misinformed narrative, or a broad concentrated effort to give people the wrong lessons through history, causes the metaphors to present themselves in generations anew through distorted and increasingly fantastical ways, and also leaves countless people to fall into similar traps. Spoilers for Metaphor ReFantazio, by the way. That's, if you haven't put that together, that's what this video is about. This concept of metaphor is presented through 2 major narrative beats of the story that I absolutely adored. After all the effort to save the prince, who had been cursed and lying, hidden away, the player fails. He is still assassinated, and hope is dead. The rightful heir to the throne is defeated. But, of course, we're not literally 1500s peasants, so we don't believe there is a rightful heir. In this moment, the player character, who has been working alongside Gallica, has it revealed to them to be nothing more than a spirit of the prince's will, and to be the true prince, a dream of an ideal world, a prince that the prince dreamed he could be. The book that the player had with them through all their journey that was owned by the prince. It was something the prince cared about. The story of an ideal technologically advanced world without magic, but with equality, where all people were one race and one power. The dream of the prince lives past his death, but more importantly, before this reveal, the team had already decided, partially because their hand was forced, to make the players claim to be the long-thought-dead prince. You see this moment over the prince's dead body as the epiphany of the main character, like that of Dionysus' epiphany, or the epiphany of Christ as baptized by John, and adopted by God as divine. The whole game, the player has fought for the dream of having a truly good prince come to the throne and fix all these problems of inequality. But that prince is dead, And sometimes holding on to that metaphor, fulfilling the prophecy by your own hands, is the only way that you can take an ideal dream and make it reality. Of course, the very nature of this epiphany by Will, the player character, could be an allegory for it alone. Or it truly could be the will of the prince brought to life with magic. The actual individual details can probably be parsed, but are not important. In fact, they miss the forest for the trees. The point is that neither of them is more important than the other. Because for the course of history in the world of metaphor, the myth reflects reality. The body of the prince was killed, but the spirit lives on. Whether it literally lived on as a manifestation of the spirit, or whether somebody spiritually took up the torch, it's really inconsequential to most people and to the result of history. The secondary twist of note, which actually happens earlier in the story, is that the modern world of metaphor ReFantazio sits atop the ruins of the world that we all live in today. That the ideal world in the storybook is actually the world that we currently live in. In fact, later in the game, we get a vision of that world through these sort of supernatural things, and we see that it's Shibuya, Tokyo. The book defines this as an era of prosperity and peace, where people were not divided among lines like poverty and race, where sex and gender had no bearing, but we, the living, in the current moment, the world this book in fact describes, like our own cultural memories of the Renaissance and the Dark Ages, similarly to the reflection of the values that we see and input onto those people in those periods, where more broadly the whole virtue of humanity was much less than we exaggerate it to be. It's because we cling on to the cultural memory, an idealized past that we could make into an improved modern reality. We look to the past for the things that worked, that succeeded, that inspire us, and we work to make what the past could have been into what it should be. In that same way, the suffering and discrimination of the game's period treats our modern society as an idealistic place, because the history doesn't propel the spirit, the metaphor does. The dream, the hope and ideal of a better place motivates people to sacrifice themselves to push humanity toward it. This reveal is made more evident whenever you learn all the races in metaphor descend from a great war with genetic experimentation and chemical warfare, leaving knowledge of culture and history completely in the dark to the modern-day races, and only bringing with them the whispers of the past. Soon, bias, discrimination, and fear take over. Factions form, sides are made, and yet, the one race, considered generally not to be people, to be subhuman, to be considered bad luck just for appearing in a public place, where the actual bosses take the forms of Hieronymus Bosch paintings, of the spiritual reflections of human weakness and desire, human is synonymous with monster in metaphor ReFantazio. There is only myth and legend about how the Elden people are connected with the humans, and so people fear the Elden people. And yet, it's because only these fractions have survived. Yet without their knowledge, they all actually come from the previously assumed to be mythically held race that's in the book. Their bodies, their buildings, their history are lying right below their feet. The least of all races in the eyes of the denizens is of the protagonist's own, as I mentioned, the Elda people. He's seen as mixed race, which is, of course, even worse to horrible bigots. Like a mule of the highly respected Clemar race and the subhuman Elda, which is a joke because the Elda, the last twist being, are actually just still humanity as we know it in our real lives. There's nothing different about the Elden people in metaphor and modern Homo sapiens. Instead, in fact, they are the only ones of the so-called races not affected by experimentation, hyper-evolution, magic, and the course with these new traits. So, let's talk about hate. In metaphor ReFantazio, the church is largely simultaneously a source that divides and does great cruelty, while having institutionalized itself as a symbol of peace for the denizens of the kingdom. Pagan practice is largely ostracized and only really thrives on their island outside of the kingdom, sticking to ancient traditions outside sanctism. However, these ancient traditions are also sloppy, horribly carried over, with different mistakes or missing different bits of info, And so even if they aren't a part of sanctism, they're still practicing things that also harm themselves and misunderstand their directions. We see this misunderstanding leading to people genuinely believing in ritual human sacrifice, with Euphrasia being the soon-to-be victim before we come by and she liberates herself. This choppy, corrupted history becomes myth, but the objects associated with the old world are still present and are instead seen as pagan magic, something the sanctists actively work to publicly retcon so that the public have a different story. The church and its reach demonize groups who could challenge their power, like the true identity of the Elden people, and the people may lose faith if they see pagan devices show more magical abilities than their claimed power from God. So, in one breath, they justify imperialism to rape the land and people and take what isn't theirs, and in another breath, they do so in the name of keeping the peace of mind in the general populace, and the metaphor that they have been taught by the culture. It is barely analysis to point out that the Sanctus Church is a clear parallel for the Catholic Church through the majority of its history. Not just through inquisitions and the mass expansion and persecuting other religions, but especially the oft-overlooked period of Christianity in its first 3 centuries. Throughout history, the church has basically been against every major progression of science or history or archaeology or technology. Anything like that that's been discovered by non-religious people have later been retconned. People called heretics, people killed, people held in towers, people restricted and chained and stopped from their research. Decades later, they'll go, well, they were a Catholic, though. They actually were Christian. They were actually Christian. Even though the Catholic Church hated them and thought they were heretical for what they were teaching, which ended up being right. It's the exact same thing. Before the large pro-Roman factions started dressing themselves in ways to mimic the generals and proper bishops of the Roman Empire, it is barely analysis to point out that the Sanctus Church is a clear parallel for the Catholic Church throughout history in our own world, not just through the Inquisitions and the mass expansion and the burning of books and the persecuting of other religions, but particularly through the cultural reclamation of church enemies after their deaths and the deaths of those who opposed them. People will point to a certain figure, a scientist, an inventor, and say, look, see, they were religious, not mentioning the fact that if they were to make known that they weren't religious, they would have likely been burned at the stake or tortured and killed. So many Protestants do this as well today, except in reference to Catholics, where they consider Catholics not to be Christians, but anytime they want to mention so-and-so ancient scientist or inventor was Christian, they never mention the fact that almost 100% of the time, the type of Christian they're talking about is Catholicism. But let's go before all of this modern baggage, especially to the oft-overlooked period which is of my personal highest interest, the first 3 centuries, before the large pro-Roman faction is adopted by Constantine in 312. Just 18 years after this, we get the Catholic Bible, a tome that stood largely in a place of unquestioned authority until revisions over 1,000 years later, and a few wars, and it wasn't until plenty of blood was spilt that the grasp to maintain that power that the Catholic Church had was eventually weakened to the point that we see it today. In the same way, the Sanctus Church higher-ups privately acknowledged the risk of people discovering pagan magic as neither truly pagan nor truly from the Sanctus Church. They recognized this similar threat. Well, if all the great scientists and inventors and people who've objectively just made the world a better place are not from our particular faith persuasion, what does that say about us? It seems almost like an attack just by them existing and being successful. And so even important figures become retconned or discredited. A key historical figure that I find very interesting is Marcion, the first person to assemble a New Testament. Eventually, Tertullian, 100 years later, declares Marcion a heretic, as Marcion strays outside of the easily controllable tradition narrative and also the particular persuasion that Tertullian found himself in, despite the modern church possibly never even having a Bible if not for Marcion. Even more ironically, Jerome, almost 200 years later, gave Tertullian the same treatment, as another 100 years of battling had gone on, and the only world Jerome lived in was a post-fusion of the Roman state government with the Christian church. You see this a lot with early church fathers after the Council of Nicaea. A temptation to act as if they know better, ridiculing, retconning, blatantly misrepresenting or disavowing major works from Christian history, whitewashing them from the record, burning all their books, and making countless theological excuses why they still use the theology of the very people that they call heretics. Because Rome adopting Christianity was the rich and powerful purchasing a large portion of the town square, and when you want one state religion, it's important to gatekeep and crush any small sects who rise too far up above their own ranks. So to most of history, Marcellina and the Carpocratians, Paul's messages about the value and the place of women get overwritten by generally agreed upon later forgeries like 1 Timothy, and stories to him with female disciples get cut out from biblical canon, such as the apostle who is considered foremost, Junia, having her name changed to resemble that of a man's. Church tradition becomes myth, becomes metaphor, and reality. A popular example of this idea that most people have heard of, though don't know the source, is that Peter was crucified upside down, reportedly because he didn't feel deserving of dying like his Lord. A very honorable and sort of poetic, beautiful thing. However, the source, or book, that this comes from is a 2nd century text, considered non-canon since the Council of Nicaea and prior. It comes from a document called the Acts of Peter, which, among other things, details talking dogs, bringing cooked fish back to life, and a straight-up wizard battle with Simon Magus, who was the leader of another sect at the time. Of course, this is a polemic against that sect, because this is the sect that became the Roman Catholic Church. This made him out into an evil wizard that Peter strikes down from the sky. Point is, even with, supposedly, Peter's sect winning the battle of power for Rome, they even decanonized some of the more major texts of that titular character of the early church. But despite this, I wasn't raised in a Catholic church or a Catholic school, but even so, I heard about Peter's out-of-context death many times growing up, his martyrdom, always as a passing mention, and we find it outside the Bible, which has the air of historicity while being a cultural memory, a meme in the scientific sense. The point is, the metaphor somehow survived. The message, and of course the beauty of opting into a worse sort of torture in order to honor the one who you love and are dying for. I only briefly dip into all of this because it is most familiar to me, and because of the obvious nature by which the Sanctists are treated as a sort of parallel for the Catholic Church. That despite this coming from a text never considered canon by the state church, that 600 years and a continent removed from the grip of the Catholic Church, after another 1,300 years, the information got to a little 10-year-old me in a random church in the Midwest. Mentioned briefly as a fun fact in passing conversation growing up in the church. Nothing controversial, nothing detailed, just a small, cool, fun fact, a little note. That is the immortality of an idea, the life of a metaphor, resting in the cultural consciousness until the moment of inspiration, the epiphanies of new generations. Going back to the Shin Megami Tensei roots of the world of metaphor, this old world like our own is more so like the worlds in pre-apocalypse Shin Megami Tensei. In SMT4, you even have a medieval society with a old Tokyo resting underneath the earth. Euphasia's pagan gods are remnants of the cultural memories, the cultural memes that persist into the present. This is reflected as Yufa's contributions to skills rest entirely on summoning the gods and demons that we associate in our own world's religions, from Shintoism to Hinduism to Christianity. Euphrasia holds on to these and uses these metaphors despite having no knowledge or understanding of the old world, the original context, or the places that they come from. And yet, in her modern moment, these cultural memories fit their metaphor. Their purpose within the human psyche remains consistent. So, as each new generation recontextualizes these ideas, a through line regardless of context remains consistent, a theme. In that sense, the game itself is a spiritual evolution of the Persona format, just as Persona was a spiritual evolution of Shin Megami Tensei. Remember, evolution isn't a ladder, but places a divergence with a common root. The Jungian influence that I dove into in my very long Persona 4 series, in a sense, is made both more abstract and more literal here, as the game intentionally mixes the fiction with the narrative. And yet, genuinely good people also serve in the Sanctus Church. They make high note of this. The early competitor is broken with his faith tested from the message sent to him by Rella, but he doesn't walk away. Instead, he roots back to the cultural memories that drove him into the Sanctus Church. Helping your neighbor, the poor, the needy, assisting those who are underprivileged. He takes up as a bishop of the Grand Trad Church, despite the fact that the church had consistently lied to him. Rella is a victim of the church, yet uses her place within it to help others, even until the end. Louis Guibern is the most central and obvious antagonist of the game from the get-go, and as the story progresses, we see more and more how the protagonist and Louis are sort of mirror images of themselves. Louis lived through and saw the Sanctus Church's genocide of the Elden people. The young poor boy could do little more to rise his station than be conscripted in the kingdom's military, often working for and under the same boot that took everything from him. The idea of working within the system to position his ideals actually mostly worked for him. His military excellence earned him a place as a protector of the people, and he even took every advantage of this to build his popularity. This meant that Louis was taking up some of the Sanctus Church's spotlight, and things were only looking worse for the Sanctists, knowing that the king's son was then also mixed race with an Elden woman. The church then attempted to assassinate the king's own son for the crime of being the wrong race, and then blame it on Louis. This leans into the divide and conquer mindset I was speaking of earlier. The Sanctus Church's tendrils ran so deep into the culture that trustworthy people, even close family, could turn out to be in on things. The ability for the Sanctus to control the narrative extended even to deceiving the hero's party. When it's revealed the true monster of Bridehaven is a Sanctus oligarch of the area, the head of the Sanctus Church takes no hesitation to cut her head off in public for all to see, and even thank the player personally. Because it's about the metaphor of what the church represents. It's about those in power, and if you need to excise a piece of flesh to save the body, the church is perfectly willing to. This isn't about any individual wrongdoing, or how the church actually operates. The reveal that Junia's own sister was the assassin sent to kill the prince just as a child, manipulated, and then used as a body double for the young Louis Guibern. The aim was to make him take the fall, and to further twist the knife. But she also, despite her station, was a victim to those at the very top, manipulated and lied to since childhood, and with the only home that she knows lying deep within the church's heart. Her family and her associates being, at a minimum, believers in sanctism, if not some of the most powerful people controlling the church. Being born into the center of a bubble like that, you can't just easily wiggle yourself out of it, especially when the lengths of evil are kept at the edge of darkness to chill those who dare resist into silence. So because of the childhood manipulation, Junia's hand can't be stayed, and she must kill her own sister, who she loves, knowing that her sister is also a victim, with the wedge that the church has built, leaving no other option. This is the masquerade of preaching love while committing a hateful anti-human evil. Since the game itself states that its story is made in reflection to reality, making the monsters people fear literally named humans, while the remnants of real humanity are all around them and within themselves, is a truly powerful sentiment. Every turn in the game, you are reminded of your race. You're called subhuman, told to leave the city because you bring bad luck, even though the church states imperialism is exactly why the Eldens, the few that survived the genocide that is, have to look to Grand Trad for help, or totally escape to secret sanctuaries and islands, because they're refugees. But Luis's philosophy spins out for revenge and doesn't hold its aim. He aims to build a world of the strong, so that we weak cannot be abused. He suffered greatly but conquered, and now sees the bureaucratic elements of the church as havens for those weaker than him to push down their boot. Luis's disregard for the other weak people, the Eldons killed in his childhood home, implicates the way that this society bent his mind and reinforced his survivorship bias. It's not uncommon for those who get lucky to fall into hubris and perpetuate the same cycle of terror, but in a more honest and straightforward fashion. When all of the cards are kept to people's chest, equality is impossible. So instead, Luis lets the cards fall where they may. Luis exists as a reaction to the Sanctus Church, and yet the pain and anger and delusion warped inside of himself lashes out to sometimes the very same people he despised the Sanctus Church for abusing in the first place. So Luis forges alone, setting to make an equal world by creating a sort of mass challenge for all those who have the will to overcome the magic. The fact, he, as a secret Elda, intentionally pushes anti-Elden propaganda in order to frame himself as the just against the player, as the highly Clamar, exposing the deep evil within the Elden people that most of the racists within Grand Trad already believed. It's a metaphor for the people to believe in. The just, highly race defeats the evil race and saves you, while in reality, they are all one race, not just in the sense that both the player and Luis are Elden, but that all of the races in metaphor descend from humans. They are all humanity. So while they are all one race, abusing the narrative and control of information, this keeps perpetuating itself. This can be seen as a challenge to the player, to show how quickly the people who all you've done is try to honestly help can get swept up in their biases and vibes based on the cultural air, moving with the wave of the masses. It's a test. These people who condemn you in their ignorance, will you take revenge and leave them to die? Or will you acknowledge they themselves have been victimized by this false information? Will you give in to revenge and side with Luis, pull up the ladder behind you and condemn those left behind? Or will you recognize that the people have been entirely manipulated into basing their core identities on lies sold to them specifically to make their own lives worse? That they lash out as a legitimate expression of pain and the fact that they've been lied to, even if they don't know it. They may never agree with you or your side. They may hate the Elden people with the greatest racist vigor they can muster until their last breath. And you can see that as a life condemned, living in darkness, manipulated by others, never truly seeing light. The fact that so many on the bottom, due to intentional efforts to delegitimize and restrict access to true education about the history and the world of metaphor, the people only stupidly believe what they think is true. It's not even stupid, in a sense. Enough is enough. People's most private convictions, their most beloved aspects, planted by evil snakes to manipulate them generation through generation, and the propaganda runs so deep that it essentially becomes a magical force, blanketing the society with thought-terminating cliches and general personal experiences vaguely grafted onto falsely cited statistics, even as Luis loudly and publicly plans to kill what is likely a large portion of his own devotees and supporters in the process. So let me ask, are you anti-human? When the anti-humans come to your door, do you fight them, befriend them, or swallow their boot? When those you find personally off-putting or scary or gross or just unlike you are being targeted and harassed, are doing things you morally disagree with, do you make jokes about their suicide rates? Do you send them death threats, call bomb threats into schools and hospitals, and do what you mistakenly think is the will of the people, robbing your humanity from you? Well, only you pay the price. Or do you retain your humanity and draw a line in the sand? For most anyone watching this video, you either have to or already have trained yourself to look 6 inches beyond your face. Because the mass starvation, cruelty, and genocide never comes to your doorstep. When humans freeze to death on the streets and are picked up before the morning comes, unseen, unforgotten, unloved. When their lives are ruined by the exponentially growing cost of staying alive, which itself is a manufactured problem easily solvable but held back by a handful of unelected tyrants. When oil tycoons, who were well aware that their drilling would lead to mass death and irreparable harm to our world, continue for 100 years to buy the silence, at best, or advocacy, at worst, of the people elected to protect you. When the active opposition of humanity itself shows up, manufacturing consent while raping the earth and your family turns around and says, "Thank you, your blood should boil." If you love your neighbor, your family, your friends, seeing this manipulation should set your soul on fire. When you are told about the problems of the day, are the persecutors the underprivileged, the poor, and the hungry? Are the leeches those who desperately are stealing a single loaf of bread for themselves or their family not to die? Or the mass producers of this bread, throwing away thousands and thousands of pounds, grinding them up to feed to livestock whenever there's even more left over? To get rid of the produce, let it rot, let it go back into the earth, because that's more profitable than feeding people just to ensure the price of food doesn't undercut their bottom line. We live in a society of mass murderers, people who use a pen to condemn generations. But imagine the virtues we attach to this era, the cultural memory that will characterize portions of modern history, the exact virtues extolled of our society in Will's book. Will we allow this to remain a metaphor, or will we fight for humanity? Will you place your will in Will's book and offer the suffering, the mercy, as to not avert your gaze, but instead to see their humanity? We're all in this together. Most people you've ever met, even the ones who've irritated you the most, are simply trying to get by and live in a world filled with unreliability. One of my favorite characters in any Atlus game has to be Fidelio. He got caught up in Luis's plans because he personally witnessed the cruel acts that the Sanctus Church committed on the Parapus, one of the races in metaphor, breaking their minds, torturing them, and then spreading the narrative that Parapus are poor, lazy criminals? I've never heard that before. Of course, Fidelio wanted revenge, but he still dreamed of a day where he could peacefully live and provide for himself and his brother. He bought into Luis's narrative that to claim power, one must disregard some of the very people he wanted to help, the abused, like him and his brother. When push came to shove, though, he would compromise on what he said needed to be done because of his soft heart. Don't let them convince you a happy world is just a fantasy. Fidelio, being faced with this very cruelty that he lived through, sacrifices himself to save members of the Sanctus Church, because those members were themselves more aligned with him than either Luis or the Church Fathers. They were parents and children, innocents, because he recognized those people are closer to being his allies than any of these people vying for power. Not the Sanctus Church themselves, but the true believers of the faith are almost entirely just like him. They were sold a narrative to force them into their own culturally designated role of submission. The irony is, a Parapus sacrificing himself for the Sanctus Church attendance is a hard message to manipulate after the effect. Such a display of love and allegiance doesn't fit into the narrative, but a sacrifice needs a message spreader, people to combat the rewriting of history. The confession of Rella, additionally, upends confidence in the organized church. In one breath, someone they care for having a public change of heart. Their loyalties are brought into question. I relate to him so much, and his brother Basilio's rage following his death. Everywhere you see people at the end of their ropes, Maria loses her father and sees her society then paint him as a villain. Brigida is manipulated into doing evil without realizing the Sanctus Church set her up to think this way. And even when she backs down from making her mistake, the church just does it themselves and blame it on her anyways. Katerina is full of energy but lacks the understanding of the broader history and scale of this threat, and so she herself buckles under the weight of trying to organize desperate parapists who have themselves only ever been cheated and treated like trash by their society. Alonzo turns to deception to build a fortune, also he can purchase legally the place where his mother and his hometown is, so they can be relieved from the pressure of the landowner's increasingly heavy boot. And what happens in response? In the process, the people in power burn his town, kill his mother, and frame it on him, then attempting to kill him too. The enemies in this world aren't likely anyone you've seen face to face, because the powerful wouldn't denigrate themselves to be in a public society without security or a stage, without proximity, just like Sanctifex Forden, call themselves independent while taking multi-million-dollar bribes, and the hope is to make it look hopeless enough to resist, to turn enough good people into personal parrots against their own interests, that the very act of helping family is something you have chance to be condemned for, like Maria's father. The hope is to keep enough people in the dark that the few who learn, change, know, and grow feel that it's too overwhelming of a shift to convey to others. It's to make people feel directionless and lost even when they overcome the wave of propaganda. I couldn't think of any better game to have come out last year. I just hope people will actually play and engage in it, and not let the most critical aspects pass them by. As a brief intermission, I was going to have a whole second part of a video here, and I kind of still do, but it's much shorter than I originally planned. I just want to humbly ask your support, and thank you for those who've supported me thus far, even though I have been in a prolonged absence. There have been a lot of personal life changes, and this is my job, but a fraction of my own part there was a surrender, briefly, to the hopelessness that I've been describing in this video. That very overwhelming sense where you know there are people you love who are being abused. And they're being abused in such a substantially, deeply ingrained way that the idea of how to even speak to them, to get across, to break through the thought-terminating cliches, to realize that you're on their side, it feels hopeless. But do people of courage and integrity even exist in the modern age? It seems like everyone has a price, but I've heard stories of good people throughout my life. And even if those people had bad aspects to them, the ideal remains in the stories we tell. My father used to tell me something all the time because I was a selfish little piece of garbage. He would tell me, put yourself in someone else's shoes. I know it's not like a super fancy saying, but it was important, and I mean, he drilled that into me. And not that I really took it to heart for a long time, but it has been something that I have continually tried to do. It's an exercise in empathy. If you don't practice your empathy, if you don't try to put yourself in other people's shoes, you will never make the world a better place. You'll never convince anybody. You'll never know what to do, and the only result after that fact is violence. I'm not a violent person. And I don't want to hurt people that I don't see as enemies. I want to have that conversation. And that's why I'm here, still. Tolkien often talked about his want to create an English mythological identity where much of the history had been lost in the long past. Stories of good friends, self-sacrifice, love, and fellowship with no borders uncrossed. The games we play, the characters we root for, the want to see light over darkness is in us. That's why the goal has never been to subvert this ideal, but instead to subvert people's understanding of reality. Because that's actually much easier to do than change the goodness in people's hearts. So they fight against this ideal without even knowing that they are. And that's how you know they're being abused, because the rationality, the reasoning, the ways that they defend what they're doing is in fact the same ideals that you hopefully still hold. It's so sad then to see people fight against this ideal without even knowing it, and I have done so plenty times in the past. I don't believe I'm doing so now. I believe I am perfectly coherent and competent. However, at a later time, I may disagree with something in this video, as has happened multiple times with multiple videos already. But the point is, I'm fighting for it. I'm fighting for the truth. And we all should aim to do that because it only helps everyone. I think that the fact that subverting people's own perception of reality is easier than subverting the things that they find valuable in, as virtues are, says something about the positive character of humanity as a whole. Where most people actively have to justify to themselves at night their actions to rest well. While some may genuinely be too far gone, or may genuinely not have these feelings, or, just be evil, I don't know. Most are, at least, people who have had their reality intentionally warped through misinformation and propaganda. The best way to show them that is an act which is too obviously true and counter to the narrative to ignore. Fidelio sacrificing himself for the Sanctist family. Euphrasia discovering their deity is no longer anything but a corpse of a human, driven mindlessly by powers totally separate to that of her faith and tradition. That she doesn't have to go in there and die for nothing, but instead can live to herald in the world to come. And so can we. The socio-political allegory of metaphor ReFantazio is an obvious looming aspect which affects all of the characters at one time or another and jolts them from the peace that they had in their normal lives as they just begin to find. However, something I think is important to highlight in this second shorter part is exactly that beauty and love. The full range of things that the characters feel and that we feel as living people in all ages, in all days. So I want to do something that I thought was kind of cute. Maria, after her father dies, is taken in by the innkeeper and always awaiting your return to tell her about your adventures. It's very cute. You get these beautiful portraits of the locations that you see inscribed onto postcards from Noras. And you can give them to Maria, and it gives her hope. It makes her feel happy and joyous of the places you're going. It gives her the hope that you're doing something, even if she's stuck at the inn. So I started taking my own postcards, so to speak, of my experience with the game, so I can hopefully remember to share them with you. Although, to be honest, a lot of them, I have trouble remembering why I took them, so there may be some weird organizing here. But I'll be honest, it was a bit overwhelming to try and organize all of this, so forgive me if it's a bit erratic. I should note this is an Atlus game, and I don't feel like dedicating 14 hours to explaining all the mythology and researching for it like I did with Persona 4. Maybe I'll do that after they release a deluxe edition overhaul version in like 3 years that completely upends a lot of the stuff in the game. I feel like it'll be more evergreen if I make the video after I have all the information. So I'll do a full rundown, but I'll leave that to others for now, or maybe do another one in the future. If this video does well, I might do smaller, more focused videos on different topics or aspects as the people watching this video comment and tell me what they want. Alright. I also don't mean to give the impression that I found the game perfect. I think aspects of Katarina's arc, as well as the given justification for Luis's plot, probably needed a bit more expanding on in my own personal taste, but you never know. Maybe they will expand upon it in that new version, and so I think the complaint is largely unimportant. There's another quote I really like, to paraphrase it. It's basically, music is as much about the notes you play as the notes you don't. In other words, the things you focus on, the things you spend your energy pursuing, say something about your own priorities. And my dad would always lecture me about having the wrong priorities and needing to get the right priorities. So, my priority is that overall, this is a fantastic game, and more people should play it. There are some flaws. I don't think it's perfect, but I think any flaws you could possibly see in it are not worth not playing it. I really didn't like the ending of Persona 5, for example, the original Persona 5, mainly because of Morgana's sort of vague speech. It felt counter to a lot of the themes and messages of the game, and perhaps that was just the English translation, I don't know. or at least too vague to take a lot out of. But Persona 5 Royal, I think, did a perfect job at fleshing out that aspect. And so I loved the ending to Persona 5's true ending, Persona 5 Royal's true ending, at least. So starting from the top, this interview, whenever you're joining the military, was great. I love that we still get stupid, insane stuff to say in conversations and metaphor, just like we do in the Persona games, and some SMT games even, like SMT4. And I'm glad that they still have very much things that feel like extensions of the characterization, rather than fourth wall breaks. Okay, looking over my screenshots, it looks like a lot of them I just took because they were funny. But that is joy to me, so we're actually just going to do a rapid fire of those ones first, probably while I'm talking, if you've been wondering why things have been changing. Then I want to focus on shot composition and directing. Then back to the thematic and narrative elements. I think the visuals in Metaphor are so often striking and well composed. Shots balance colors with intentionality, and the locations are dynamic and engaging. Specifically, something that we see are the strong contrasted blues and reds to frame environments. But beyond that, the environments are often so lush and detailed. I love small details like the windmills far off in Brylehaven. It reminds me of the windmill area in Dark Souls 2 or the fields in Haibane Renmei. I love the consistent scale and scope of things. The shots often give opportunities to see broader landscapes, and they all feel shaped very intentionally. Now, I don't really know that much about film, so not to be like a first-year film student meme here, but there are also really cool shots using the rule of thirds that I think are super intentional, both from left to right and from top to bottom. So, if you want a beautiful adventure, aside from a few little critiques I have of the lighting in some areas, I think this is very easily the best looking Atlus game ever made so far. Now, Persona 3 Reload does have a better character model and rig system and all that sort of stuff. It's been totally overhauled. So in that sense, Metaphor sort of feels like a middle step between P5R and P3R, which makes sense because they were both somewhat developed concurrently. But the environments are just stunning and so lived in. They feel like real locations in a world which I honestly don't think I've really felt to this extent in any other Atlus game. It feels like I'm in a real world, a fantasy world, a place to explore, people to meet. Next, I'll show my love for my wife, Yufa. I jest, but I feel like her and Will are very perfect together. They are sort of both a born yesterday goober with a strong sense of justice, but also a strong sense of whimsy. They're very silly. I love how silly they are. If you're a Will X Stroll person, I can see that too, to be honest. I've seen enough cute fan art that I can see it. But I personally come down on Will and Yufa, just being more spiritually similar to one another. So, it's a matter of taste, I guess. You're willing to disagree. Give me your arguments in the comments. Okay, so now for the screenshots that I took for more thematic or plot-driven reasons. I really like the drip feed of lore and backstory. Gallica and Will talk like longtime good friends, and so the exposition between them is actually pretty light. You get this sort of sense of like a mystery or like unveiling what the world is like. I think it's naturally much more immersive than you typically get. Especially, and listen, I love Persona, but if there is one thing the Persona games have too much of, it's exposition. It takes like 10 hours to even get into like the actual gameplay loop of Persona 5 because of so much stuff getting introduced to you and so much plot and all that. So I personally really prefer this, but not just that, I think this thematically reflects itself well with what the game is all about. Partially because this writing style leans in on the eventual reveal that they themselves are under a magic illusion. That despite believing that they had always been close friends, just as the player does based on the context of the story, there is no actual history to be told. This plot twist perfectly marries the way that the player perceives the characters with the way that the characters perceive themselves, which was brilliant and made a lot of sense. Gold star, amazing. Grius was also so cool to see join the party so early, and then killing him to set more of the plot into motion and motivate the player. This isn't the first time that a playable character in an Atlus game gets killed off. In fact, they've done it a lot. They've done it quite a few times in quite a few ways. But I like that you maintain the plot heaviness without causing a separate type of frustration from the player, which is something I think that sometimes this can lean into. For example, although I'll keep things general to avoid spoilers for other games, If you don't get a party member until halfway into the game, and then really like them, or they're really strong compared to the others, so you dedicate a bunch of time leveling them up while leaving other party members sort of on the bench, so to speak, you essentially lose all the time that you dedicated into leveling them up while not leveling up your more permanent characters when they die. This isn't wholly negative, since it does in some way connect the sadness of the player in the story to the sadness of the player as a person playing a game. The issue is, since games have a standard for not giving you things to invest into and then removing them without warning, this can feel kind of cheap to the player or disrespectful to their time. On one hand, the loss you feel is more real, but also the type of loss you feel is a personal inconvenience. There are ways around this, though, and I think that making Grius one of your first comrades and also killing him does two things. First of all, it tells the player that any character through the rest of this game could die, so the player won't feel cheated later if anything like that happens. You set the standard for engagement with the game rather than resting upon the assumptions, which gives great care to the player's investment in the game as a piece of art. Additionally, putting him early on in the game reduces the amount that a normal player would even have the capability to invest into him. Oh, I like the amount of optional challenges to put in there as well. This dragon I initially thought would totally whoop me, so I snuck past them in my first playthrough, but in New Game Plus, I fought them. That sort of thing with variation and sort of non-essential but cool alternate things to do is very fun, obviously something I love in games, and I think Metaphor does this really well. Also, I really like the running segments. There's like 2 of them, I think. It's not very much. Once in the Nordic Mines, and then once, I think, closer to the end of the game. They remind me of the running from the troll in Harry Potter and the Sorcerer's Stone that I had on PC when I was negative years old. Before I was playing Harry Potter 1 and the Sorcerer's Stone before I was conceived, essentially. The idea of the runners was brilliant as well, although I'm not saying it's something that in its totality is an original idea. The fact that the surroundings dynamically move with the otherwise isolated segments gives the player a real sense of momentum and time passing, and it's sort of a journey. Although I do find these environments a lot less visually engaging as elements sometimes, especially because I played the game on PS5, and it's just like, the game could look a lot prettier. It was still a really cool effect though. I really appreciated it. Including this because, God, I love Fidelio and Stroll and all the good boys and gals. Also, I found the candidates, both minor and major, to be super full of personality, like the Hunter exam in Hunter x Hunter or the major pirates from One Piece. Including this postcard of Maria because my heart shattered into a million pieces. Additionally, this quote of Fidelio's, I think, demonstrates my point in this video. You know, actually, I have a lot of screenshots of amazing quotes from the game, so perhaps I'll put them up right now, for posterity's sake, and come back to their ideas later when I can flesh them out or give them more focused attention, maybe in their own videos or a later reference to them. Oh, this Basilio quote also shattered my heart, but for a separate reason, and I just want to share my own personal experience with you. Hearing, "You've got a heart of gold," always takes me back to a rough period of depression that I was in. In 2020, I was playing the original Demon's Souls for the first time. The remake did no justice to this, but where I was in my life, and the bleak mood of Demon's Souls, something about the art style, I think, really resonates with me more than, I guess, any of the FromSoft games since. At least in, like, specific areas. For a while, it made the PS3 Demon's Souls my favorite FromSoft game purely because of its emotional effect on me. So, as small as it'll probably seem to almost everybody else, I did want to share this beautiful soundbite from Demon's Souls.
You have a heart of gold. Don't let them take it from you.
Something else I'd like to write is that, either spiritually or literally, the king is your father. The idea of a divine lineage and common myth and mindset around the crown is actively challenged in the game though, and I'm really glad that they do that. You aren't asked to defend the king or believe that he was a good king, but that was wrongfully dethroned, but instead to pity him as a sort of shell of himself that slowly was too weak to deal with the powers trying to influence him. Fidelio and Lewis offer salient and exceptionally accurate critiques of the king, and do not give him the excuse to wiggle out of his responsibility despite his weakness. I agree that it was better for Luis to kill the king to prevent the state church from assuming dictatorial control, because the king's weakness and grief stayed his hand from enacting justice that the poor people of Grand Trad desperately needed from those in power. It's strange to fundamentally agree with the actions of someone I fundamentally think is wrong, but that is the level of nuance that Metaphor ReFantazio gives. And it would have been so easy, and I've seen this with other Atlus games in the past even, where it feels like they don't go far enough or commit enough to the thematic conclusion, the logical conclusion of their claims. And here it really feels like they don't double back on it. It's wonderful. This quote from Barden, I think, and his arc is also quite valuable, so I want to briefly talk about Barden. Unknowingly, Barden helped those in power commit evil while protecting them, while desperately trying to help the people around him that he was failing at. He was fooled, but in response, he took the responsibility to try and fix things on himself. Whenever he did wrong later and made mistakes that were all his own fault, but were genuine, sincere mistakes, when the people turned against him and said awful things that weren't even necessarily true, he didn't allow himself to become resentful and give in to grievance politics. He set out to improve himself. Well, maybe a little too insecure for my taste, Barden is a great role model for these ideas that I've been talking about here. This line from Basilio's arc also really got to me. Another case of the hate and greed of the powerful, causing not just Junia to kill her sister, but Basilio to kill his dear friend and sort of spiritual second brother. This idea of divide and conquer from the powerful and the depth and action needed to uproot these institutionalized tendrils that turn people against each other really echoes in each of these scenarios with the different characters. There's a cool moment where the stability of Grand Trad is dropping before the climax of the story, where a Parapus, who used to kill other often innocent Parapus by virtue of state execution as a literal dog of the state, gets savaged and killed by other Parapus once things start becoming less stable in Grand Trad. And, I think that's a cool inclusion into the story. It's a clear mirror to the ideas of class traitors, or, in this case, since they were also Parapus, something like an Uncle Tom. We see this in Stroll's arc as well. Stroll's hometown was savaged by humans, so his parents are dead, the buildings are destroyed, and his people are homeless. We see, despite his social stature as a lord and his racial status as a Clamar, that the roots of capital will always supersede these institutions if you aim to turn against the interest of the powerful. Another fun detail in the epilogue is that, in the words of the city crier, it's surprise after surprise ever since us churchfolk got boot from the palace. It would be so easy to not reform the state once winning, or reform it in small menial ways that barely help the average person, or even from a writing perspective, it would have been easy for Atlus to just not even mention or talk about what happens with the church after the fact. But Will, acting without the player's input, makes the correct decision to allow people the freedom of their faiths, and to erect a wall of separation between one faith and the state's power. Sanctism still thrives, it's still a major part of the community. It's not being cracked down upon, but they don't get the preferential treatment to which they used to. That's all for me, for now. If we band together, fantasy can live on. Also, I'm making a video game. Follow me on Blue Sky to see updates, since, as people are well aware, I barely ever post to Twitter anymore, because it's basically a landfill where only people who play ball are treated well. And I'd rather cut off my own legs than play ball with a sub-50 IQ, inhuman, narcissistic lunatic like Elon. Okay. Well, I hope you enjoyed the video. Sorry it's been so long. They took Steven Universe off of HBO Max, and that has become a peculiar thing for my process. Definitely demotivating. The Season 4 video is coming, and it's even, mostly written at this point. Although my passion for it has definitely waned severely, and I really don't want to phone in my analysis. I don't want to just give you something that's very boilerplate. Care for those you love, and pray for those who persecute you.